I'd like to thank everyone for coming to the Superior Schoolhouse. And we are always debating whether we want to have our schoolhouse lecture in the schoolhouse or in a bigger space. Tonight might have been one of those nights a bigger space would have worked better, but it wouldn't have as much character as the schoolhouse. So we're happy you're all here and you're cozy. If there are seats by you, I'm not seeing, raise your hand just so I have a sense if people come in late. If there's an empty seat near you, raise your hand. So there's one over here, one, okay. Okay, a short person's chair. Okay. So tonight we're going to hear from two excellent speakers. Usually we just get one, so tonight's a sort of twofer for us tonight. I'm going to start with a couple little short housekeeping things. My name is Kara Hamley O'Donnell. I'm a city planner at the City of Cleveland Heights. The Superior Schoolhouse is owned and operated by the City of Cleveland Heights, and so this is your tax dollars at work, so I'm glad to see so many people here today. As far as entrances and exits, there's an exit there. You can also get in or out this way, and this is also where the restrooms are. Upstairs is another room that's sort of our archive, and we've got that shut off today because, well, it needs to be organized. We have a lot of archival material up there right now. So tonight we're going to be learning about the area right around where we are, the Forest Hill neighborhood. I'm just curious how many people live in that neighborhood. I do too. So this will be very fun to learn about. And as you all know, this area has been recently listed on the National Register of Historic Places. We also have a couple other neighborhoods in Cleveland Heights that are currently being considered for listing on the National Register. As you know, Mark Souther, who's going to be speaking tonight, was responsible for listing Forest Hill on the Historic District. We also tonight have Mary Dunbar. Mary, you can maybe stand up. Mary is working to put the Shaker Heights, Shaker farmland, which is along Fairmount Boulevard roughly between Taylor and Coventry, on the National Register of Historic Places. And is Marion Morton here tonight? Marion Morton is putting the Euclid Heights allotment, which is sort of the large residential area that runs between Cedar Fairmount and Coventry, on the National Register of Historic Places. And I can't think of any other community across the country that has this many people who dig in and have the guts, not with any architecture training or history training, to dig in and start to find a way to get their neighborhood recognized. I think Cleveland Heights has got to be one of the leaders. The people at the state always say, another person in your city is doing this. So I think that's something to brag about from our standpoint. So we're going to start, you're speaking first, right? Korbi Roberts is a Cleveland Heights native, and she currently lives in Virginia Beach, and she came all the way back here to share her knowledge and history, and somehow has managed to do all this research and not being here in Cleveland, which is, I think, pretty impressive. She works for the Commonwealth of Virginia and works with autistic children's programs in the public schools. But her real hobby, and we're lucky to share her strength, is being a sort of amateur hobby historian. And then I think I'll just introduce Mark now as well. Followed by that, she'll start with sort of the early history of the neighborhood, and then that will roll into Mark Souther, who did do the National Register nomination. And Mark is a associate professor of history in Cleveland State's History Department, and also has been working diligently with the Center for Public History and Digital Humanities at Cleveland State. And maybe when Mark gets up, he could do a little commercial for his app. For those of you who have smartphones, there is a mobile history app, and there are many Cleveland Heights sites that are listed on that app, and they include history and oral history and photographs and little sort of Ken Burns style videos on some of our favorite places around Cleveland and in Cleveland Heights. So Mark might be able to give us a little taste of that just in his description. So I have a dumb phone, so we don't have that. I don't have that ability to do that. But if you have any questions afterwards, I'm sure what we'll try to do is have the speakers speak, and then we can do some short questions and answers afterwards, and then after each speaker, and then we can go back and forth and do some more questions after that. Okay? Thank you. All right. Thank you very much.
Okay. Thank you all for coming tonight. I had heard that Mark Souther was doing the National Register of Historic Places of our beloved Forest Hill allotment here, this neighborhood right nearby. And it turned out I'd been working a couple years on the history that covered about 100 years before that. So I said, let's get together and I'll do 1796 through, the early 1900s, and you could do the allotment, the suburb period, the development period. So that's how we got here tonight. And thank you all for coming. Here's my thanks to Mark. Okay. I was curious about what the allotment land looked like when it went from farmland to when it was first developed, and I located this picture, and I thought it was so fantastic because it's the only one that I know of. Real quick, that's Coventry Road. We're looking south. This is Cedar Road. This is Lee Road right here. This, of course, is, I'm trying to use this pointer, is Washington Boulevard going through there. And you can see all the trees newly planted. Here's the meadow right here of the farmland. And this, really important to the development and to this area of Cleveland Heights, is the watershed. And Dugway Brook comes right in here. This is where Coventry School is. And one branch of Dugway Brook goes here, and then goes here, becomes Meadowbrook. It's underneath Meadowbrook Road. And there's a little piece of Dugway Brook that runs here along Euclid Heights Boulevard and Lincoln. And then the other part of Dugway comes right here. And Dugway is important because it ran the early mills of the area. And yes, this area did have some mills right on the border, and these farmers depended on that. Okay, now real quick, not to go into Mark's talk, but I wanted to show you what area we're talking about as far as land. This is the early boundaries of Grant Demings allotment, and we see Lee Road. Lee Road again, Euclid Heights Boulevard, Coventry, and then Cedar Road along the bottom here. You're looking at the modern streets of the allotment. This is an aerial view, and it's the same area I just showed you. Lee Road here, Superior, Euclid Heights, Coventry. And you can see, look at the density of houses. Houses and the streets and the trees. It certainly is a forest city. And we were trying to figure out how many people have called that home over the years. Something like 15,000 people have called that little area home. And then real quick, I ran up and down the streets at Christmas because I wanted to get a picture looking down the streets without the greenery in the way. And here's some shots and some characteristics of the homes that we know about, which make it very fascinating to me. Many of the houses were built with the coal rooms in the basement, and a lot of them have the mechanical or electrical calling systems to summon servants. Servants' quarters, narrow hidden staircases from the kitchens to the upstairs. Many homes have that. Fireplaces, but no air conditioning. Upper porches for shaking rugs. Just a very few characteristics, some characteristics here. Clothes chutes, built-in bookshelves in the homes. Separate pantry rooms, chandeliers, leaded glass. This was a very classy development. Topiary gardens, fountains, fish ponds. Remember Avon calling and Girl Scout cookies. You want to buy some Girl Scout cookies? And the old Coventry School newspaper drives. We used to go all over with our wagons as kids. And I saw many of the Euclid Heights development homes, some of the luscious mansions, because I used to go in there and they'd fill up my red wagon full of newspapers. Okay, block parties, etc. Okay, and then I wanted to do this bird's eye view, get a better look at the houses real quick. See, just amazing number of houses. From the ground, they're gigantic, and the yards are spacious. From the sky, they're really packed in there. Okay, and as I was doing the research, when I was surprised to find out that the houses of the Grant Demings Forest Hill allotment actually had servants' quarters, I noticed from the census records that if you start down at Cedar Hill in the Euclid Heights allotment, the servants there, they numbered in about 8 to 6 servants per home. And then as you went up the hill, East Overlook, Edge Hill, Berkshire, to Coventry, the number got less and less to about 3 servants. And then as soon as you went east to Coventry, you had 1 servant. And there were actually a lot of homes that had one servant, which I was really surprised, or a mother-in-law who helped out. So that's a, bless her heart. So we looked at Lincoln Boulevard, and out of the 53 homes, there were, do I have the number there? 13 live-in servants. And they were live-in servants. They didn't just come up the hill from the mass transit. They actually lived in the homes here to help out the families originally. Okay? Growing up in Grant Demings Forest Hill allotment. And here's my personal connection. A lot of people in this room can relate to this and have been to this home in the allotment. There it is in the middle, 2870 East Overlook, bird's eye view. And the dormers were added later on. Here's a view of the home over the years from the 60s, the 70s, and current times. These were big houses. We called it the big house, as a lot of people in here know, have been in it. I thought a wonderful place to grow up. The Coventry School that a lot of us remember so well. This is a class from Coventry School from about 1924. I found in the Heights Cauldron. I thought that was kind of poignant there. See that group? Of course, the school's not there anymore, as you all know. This is my snapshot of the history of the Forest Hill allotment land. We start with the spoon in the lower middle. As a kid, I'd sit in the backyard with my mom's silverware and I'd dig in her flowers up in the garden. And I used to wonder, oh, am I going to find arrowheads? You know, who used to traipse along this ground? And my mom would say, where are all my spoons? And then when the snow would melt, they'd be glistening in the sun in the spring out in her garden. So it starts with the 5 of us girls here, and is it making a funny sound? Okay. And we have mammoth, mastodon used to traipse this land, bison, bear, the mound builders, the Indian tribes used to walk on this land. Yes, there were cabins here. Then we have the farmland come in, then the development along with, see a golfer here? The development, and that's a little quick history. When I did the research, I noticed that there were basically 4 layers of history that occurred right here on this land, including this. We're on lot 48 right now, which borders the Forest Hills allotment. And basically, the analogy I came up with is it's like a theater stage where there's 4 different plays that go on throughout time. The stage sets are different, the actors are different, and although there's some overlap, they basically completely change. When one play's over, the sets are taken off real quick and another group of people come to then do their play. And so we have, if we're looking at, late 1700s, when about the time Moses Cleveland came in, they would have found, wilderness, forest. They would have found the native Indians camping. Yes, they did camp here. They were itinerant, very transient. Then when the pioneers came in, the Indians almost totally disappeared. And then you had the cabins and the early settlers. They began to clear the forest. I think it's called the mud and stump period, something like that. And then they own big areas of land, and then that land is subdivided to smaller parcels, and then then it becomes the farm era. The cabins are replaced by farmhouses, the roads come in, and then finally the farmland is bought up and becomes the suburban developments. So, and here's a home in the Forest Hills allotment. So those are the 4, if you keep those in your mind. And I'm really talking about these 2 middle ones, the pioneer to the end of the farming era. Here's an example I found. This is what the early roads around here would have looked like. Coventry was a very early road, Superior, Lee, even Mayfield, and they would have originally been Indian paths like this, and they followed the ridges and the streams. And Coventry is interesting because it's the top of a ridge, and it follows the Dugway watershed. And Coventry is the dividing line between the Doane watershed and the Dugway watershed. So it probably has always been a path, at least the part from Lakeview Cemetery down to about Cedar, where it probably followed Dugway along Meadowbrook Road. And this, excuse these notes here, but this is an example of sort of the economics of all four of those different plays. And of course the Indians, starting with the Indians here in this area on this land, they would have used the natural vegetation, they would have left things untouched. Basically, there were way too many mosquitoes. They were superstitious about the snakes, so they didn't harm them. So when the settlers came in, there were tons of snakes everywhere. Then we go into the cabin period here and the mills. There were mills all over the place. It's really, really neat. Above Coventry, as you go down to Lakeview Cemetery, there was a grist mill there in 1809, Caleb Eddy's. Right here behind the schoolhouse, the part of Dugway Brook that's underground, as you follow it a little bit further down the road, there was a sawmill running on this water, Robert Young's sawmill, and he owned part of the Forest Hill land, obviously cutting down the trees and sawing up those trees for the frame structures that were coming in. And let's see, anything else from here? Quarrying, of course, we know about the orchards and the vineyards because the soil of the area was good for that. Then we move into, in the maybe 1820s and 30s, the cabins were being replaced by framed houses and barns, and you had the grain growing in this area. The mills begin to disappear. The dirt roads are widened, and some are planked. Of course, we have the railroads and the horse-drawn street railways. And I tried to put the population down here, too, to compare the four. With the Indians, there's a transient residence going by foot or by horse. Then we have, during the cabin era, dozens of people going by foot, horse, oxen, sleigh, and wagon. Sleigh was very common. A lot of people made their way to the Western Reserve, of course, from the east on sleighs, and also by foot. And then the framed house period, where now the population of this little section here is in hundreds. And then last, we get to the suburban period, where although there's some farms remaining, the developments are beginning to be, the farmland's being bought up and the developments are being put in. Now you get homes of brick and stone. The roads are paved with asphalt, macadam, and brick. And let's see, it becomes the country living for the people of the city, automobile, electricity, etc. So that was, I apologize for that little academic thing there, but this is a neat postcard I found. I thought, oh, this is so apropos. Here we have, it's a centennial souvenir. It's an advertisement for a business, and the Cleveland Dryer Company. And you can see they've shown the same piece of land here. Here's the cabin period, and then here's the same area now, frame house. It's a family farm. Here's the train in the background. I thought that was a really neat postcard. And you see the stacks of grain here. This is Cleveland Heights used to be called East Cleveland, and Cleveland Heights sits right in here. And I was curious, it's so hard to get information about the day-to-day life of the people in this area, so when I looked at the 1860 census, I wanted to know what they told the census taker they did for a living. And I thought, wow, using that statistic, we can see exactly what they were doing. So here's a list. I broke it down by a number of people here. Most of them are farmers. I can't read this, but from here. But it's farmers and laborers, and it's oh, you can't see it either. It's not big enough. Basically, you know, there's 3 lake captains and some sailors, and there's blacksmiths and harness makers and millers and that kind of thing. But it's an interesting list to see. I'll try to get that bigger somewhere, but. I love these old Cleveland postcards, but of course, early Cleveland Heights, or in this area, when the settlers and pioneers came in, they were overlapping the previous residents, and so I thought that was. They say that there were a lot of bears along Doane Brook, Now, here's a real quick, looking at the Western Reserve. You'll notice that here's Connecticut here, and the Western Reserve is the same parallels here as Connecticut, and I guess that's why they got it. And eventually they gave it up to Ohio. And here's a close-up of that northeast part of Ohio, the Western Reserve, Connecticut Western Reserve, shows Cleveland and Cleveland Heights right there. Okay. Now here, real quick, we're going to zoom into it, and I want you to see the grid that overlies the Western Reserve in the Cleveland area. And this grid is very important because anybody doing any kind of research from, if you want to even research your own house, your house deeds are eventually going to mention one of these squares, one of these townships and ranges. So it helps to know that this grid is overlying us right now. And as a matter of fact, this grid represents the townships. And this is Euclid Township. And the Forest Hill allotment land is in Euclid Township. We're right there in that lower corner, the lower southwest corner, in two little squares there. And this is Warrensville Township. This is the old Cleveland, the old Newburgh. And, it shows you up here. And you can see when the surveyors came in, they started at this corner right here. They landed up here at Conneaut, and they came down here. And you see the numbers here. These are the townships, 1, 2, 3, 4, and so on, going up, township numbers. And these are the range numbers going this way. And Cleveland Heights actually includes all 4 of those townships, but basically, you can see Euclid Township is Township 8 in the 11th range. There's the 11th range and the 8th township. And then Warrensville, which Cleveland Heights also is in Warrensville, it's Township 7 in the 11th range. Okay. And now we're going to zoom in. We're going to zoom into the township now. There we go. This is the Cuyahoga County. These blocks are the townships. They all have a number. So we have, the 8th township in the 11th range, the 7th township in the 11th range. And now I'm showing you how Cleveland Heights in the red overlaps all 4 of these townships, Euclid, Warrensville, the old Newburgh, and the old Cleveland Township. And what's funny is, see that point, the 4 corners right there? That spot is at the intersection of Cedar Road and Overlook Lane. That's the 4 corners, and Demington. So you can actually stand there and go, wow, this is where the surveyor actually walked up Demington Road and right through here, cutting down, stepping over snakes and cutting down the brush and that kind of thing. So Cedar Road yes, Cedar Road's the bottom of old Euclid Township right there. So I thought that was kind of interesting. Now we're going to do a close-up on one of the townships. We're looking at Euclid mostly because that's the Forest Hill allotment right there, where we are right now. Okay, so 4 corners. All right, this came from Bill Barrow's wonderful master thesis on the Euclid Heights allotment. And if you haven't read that and you love Cleveland history, you got to read that. And here is Cleveland Heights boundaries, actually an older boundary. Here, you can see the townships, they've divided up into lots now. And that's what we need to focus on. These lots are about 160 acres each. These towards the city are 100 acres. You can see Cleveland Heights has some of these 100 acres. This is lot 8 and 49. We're actually in lot 48 right now where we're standing. We're right in that lower corner of lot 48, which is tied into lot 49 and lot 8. Some of the same landowners at the same time are owning land in both. Okay, so Grant Demings Forest Hill allotment land is the right half of lot 8. And all of 49 and a tiny bit of lot 48, which we're standing in. And this is another view to sort of help you out, compare it to today's map. This line right here is the bottom of Euclid Township, and there's Cedar Road. This is lot 8, and you see Coventry Road runs right through lot 8. So this half of lot 8 is the Euclid Heights development, but this half of lot 8 and 49 and a tiny bit of 48 is the Grant Demings Forest Hill allotment land. And this picture, let's see if I might need to refer back to this, but basically you can see we're going to talk about the Streeter farm and the Duty farm and that farmhouse, and I'm going to show you a picture of the farmhouse over here. All right, hang on, what did I do? There we go. I knew I was going to do that at one time. Okay, and then real quick, I wanted to say, if you're doing history in this area, standing right on the spot, these are the names that you would have to know this spot by. It starts out by, if you go back far enough in time, the records will only say Connecticut Western Reserve. Of course, they will not say Cleveland Heights. Then at one point, you'd be looking up the records of Trumbull County. It's hard to believe, and there's a map showing you Western Reserve is Trumbull County. And then you go up here, it was Track 1 of Euclid Township. It was also called the East End of Cleveland. It was East Cleveland Township, Village of Cleveland Heights, and Cleveland Heights. Okay, here's, we know Moses Cleveland, and here's a little saying I thought was very, very sad, but it's one of the comments of a Western Reserve Indian chief. My people are like the scattered stalks that remain in the field when the tempest has passed over it. The red man must starve or leave the graves of his fathers and make his bed with the setting sun. So some of the Indians would come back, the native Indians would come back to visit the graves of their ancestors that were in this area, even during the settler period. Moses Cleveland, he struck a hard bargain with the Indians. Some of the surveyors did not like him, said he was kind of a gruff guy. Okay, so the purpose of the slide is now I'm going to tell you who owns this land. I tried to go back way to the beginning and then little by little tell you who actually owns this land. So we start with the first owner, Connecticut Land Company. Then we go to the second owners of this lot, of this area, belong to two of the surveyors. And if you guys have read the Euclid Creek book, the Roy Lyric book, where he talks about the history of Euclid, he talks about how this was called the protester lots because the surveyors, after slogging through the swamps and having to map out the Western Reserve, they felt they deserved something. So they were allowed the chance to own Euclid Township. Only the stipulation was so ridiculous. They had to have a certain number of crops planted by a certain time, certain number of acres cleared, cabins put up, that literally, besides Amzie Atwater and Morley, a guy by the name of Morley, none of them ever were able to claim these lots. These were supposed to go to Amos Barber and Luke Hanchett, who were two of the surveyors, and they really never got to have them, but that's who it was supposed to go to. Third owner. The third owner was a man by the name of Henry Champion, because now I'm going to talk about some of the owners and a little bit of their history. And Henry Champion, he owned, what happened was that they couldn't sell the lots in the Western Reserve. They weren't going very fast. It was, as you know, probably know from history, the Western Reserve was, they didn't have roads and bridges, no infrastructure. It was too far for people to come, basically. So they didn't sell like hotcakes like they thought they would. So they had to re-divide up Euclid Township into what's called tracts. And they'd group a bunch of lots together. Here's part of Lot 8 and part of Lot 49. And that's 160 acres, that's 160 acres. And then they offered them to investors in Connecticut in various areas. So Henry Champion bought this Tract 1, which included the Forest Hill land, and his sister was married to Moses Cleveland. So a lot of these early land buyers, it's all in the family, they all knew each other, they had similar professions, that kind of thing. And here's a picture of Henry Champion, and this is on the National Register of Historic Places. It's still there, his home back in Connecticut. He passed on his land here in the, well, he had Lot 8, obviously, and Lot 49, all of those two lots and more, and he passed it on to his son, Aristochus, maybe? I don't know how it'd be pronounced. That's the best picture I could find of him. I wanted to show you one example of a deed. This is the deed selling the Forest Hill allotment land. It's Henry Champion is selling it now to a man by the name of Robert Young. And he's important in history because he had the sawmill right down Dugway Brook here, just yards away. And you can see, I thought it was cute, Cleveland at this time is still spelled with the A. You know, that unique spelling. I thought that was interesting. Here's his stone, his marker in the East Cleveland Township Cemetery. And you know, that cemetery is just so fabulous because it really should be called the Cleveland Heights Cemetery, because all the early settlers are really buried in that cemetery. And thank goodness for Nancy Adams, Nancy Fogle West, and all the people who have restored it and brought it back and saved it and preserved it, because it's all the history of this area, and it's so important, that the cemetery. I just can't say that enough. Robert Young was married to the main surveyor of the area. Is it Ahaz Merchant? Does anyone know how to pronounce his first name? Does that sound right? A-H-A-Z. Ahaz Merchant was Robert Young's brother. I just did this morning, so. Anyway, they were related to each other, and as a matter of fact, he surveyed this lot that we're standing on. And here's just a little history of the family I wanted to include. Their children, the land then passed on to their children, Napoleon Young and Huldah Young. And then the mother, Rebecca Merchant Young, remarried and married John Welch. And that's Cleveland Heights' name, some of you may know. And there's their grave, also in the East Cleveland Township Cemetery. And then their daughter buried into the Green family of Cleveland Heights. Okay.
That cemetery is like the one on the other side of the
Yeah, well, it's amazing because it's so close to us right now, and yet it's so hidden that people don't know it exists. And right, you know, the entrance, the Euclid Avenue entrance to Lakeview Cemetery right there? Well, literally, if you cross the street, if the railroad were not there, you'd be right in the East Cleveland Township Cemetery. It's right there.
East 118.
And you actually get to the entrance is on East 118th. It used to be off of Euclid, and of course, when the railroad right-of-way came through, it's completely blocked, but it's right there, and it's just fascinating. If you've never seen it, you should really drive through. It's amazing. Okay, and the next landowner is Park Brown Clark, and P.B. Clark you might have heard because he sold the land for the schoolhouse. He owned this piece of land as well as a big portion of the Forest Hill allotment land. And here's an old map. It's not a very accurate one, but because Coventry actually runs through the middle here, and these lots would be off to the side a little bit, and Dugway is poorly drawn. But anyway, but you can see, here's the Forest Hill allotment land. We're sitting, let's see, we're right about here in the schoolhouse on lot 48. And yeah, right about there, I guess you would say. And you can see here it's showing the Green family. Well, this is Huldah Green, Robert Young's daughter, owning this piece of land. She inherited it from him. Here's John Welch, and here's Park B. Clark. And also I want to show you the Duty family, because the Dutys were brickmakers, and I'm going to talk a little bit about them. And here's Coventry Road right here, and right where Edge Hill and Coventry are was their farmhouse, and there was a farm structure over here on this side on Edge Hill. Okay. Park Brown Clark, this family, they're from Twinsburg, they came from Connecticut. They were hotel owners, and a lot of the people of this little area had something to do with hotels. I thought that was interesting, maybe because Mayfield Road, there were probably some taverns along Mayfield Road. And I couldn't find a picture of him, but I did find a picture of his brother in the Twinsburg Historical Society, Elmore. And they had hotels there at the square in Twinsburg. Both his brother and also P.B. Clark also had a hotel there. The Clark family moved around a lot. By 1860, he was in Illinois, as you see, and then in Kansas, and they even went to Nebraska. So there's the Duty family. Andrew Woodbury Duty and his brother. This again it's showing you, are you guys lost or you know pretty much? Okay, this is Coventry Road, there's Mayfield Road, the old State Road, here's Superior, here's Lee, here's Cedar. You can see Cedar's not even through yet. See how it says the word school? We're right here. tonight, we're right there. The sawmill lot, Robert Young's sawmill lot is right here. That's where, and Robert Young owned this land in here, well, actually all this lot. And the dugway is not drawn very well here. It actually came down into the sawmill lot where the sawmill was. And this is the house at, used to be, at Edge Hill in Coventry. And I'll show you some more pictures of that. It was a square brick house, and the Duties made brick. Let's see if I need to say anything more about that. Here's the haycock. I'm going to talk about haycocks next, and there's the haycocks meadow. Remember I pointed out that meadow at the very beginning? And that's the house I'm going to show you a picture of right there, that farmhouse. It's no longer there, of course. Okay, so the Duty family, the father was Ebenezer Duty, the mother Abigail Sally Warren. She was the daughter of Moses Warren. And you know, Moses' son Daniel is the namesake of Warrensville Township. And the family came in 1808. The Duty family, they were expert brickmakers. They met up with Gideon Granger, and lucky for them because when they built the courthouse for Gideon Granger, it was like in Jefferson County or something like that. As a result, they were given this land. That's how they earned this land here in this area, was from making the brick. And then they came here in the Cleveland area and made brick for a long time. And here's the two sons who own the Forest Hill allotment land. And here's their stone in the East Cleveland Township Cemetery. Very beautiful stone. It says Duty there at the bottom. And some of the Duty family walked here. I thought this was interesting because they said in the Duty history that, I didn't have any pictures of Ebenezer or Daniel or Andrew, but they said that this middle drummer looked like Ebenezer Duty. And I thought, well, that's interesting. And I don't know if this is a very famous painting. It's in the Western Reserve Historical Society. And there's a lot of connections with the Forest Hill allotment because it connects to the, this comment about the Duty family. It also connects to the Shakers, I'll show you in a minute, who worked with the farmers here in the Forest Hill allotment. And the painter is Archibald McNeil Willard. He was from Bedford. He painted signs on wagons. And when he started to draw this painting, it was going to be a cartoon originally, and then when he talked to the old Revolutionary veterans, he realized it needed to be very serious. And it was about the time that his father was ill, and his father died soon after. And this is actually supposed to be modeled after his father, and not after Ebenezer Duty, even though they say it looks just like him. And this is an ad for Brooks Oil. You can see that they've parodied it here. And here again is that same painter, Archibald McNeil Willard. And this is fantastic because this is the Shaker Old Stone Grist Mill that used to be behind Roxborough Junior High School, right there on Doan Brook. There at North Park near Coventry Road. And that waterfall's still there. You can still see the grooves in the side of the Doan Brook where the dam was. The head race to the mill where the water flowed is still there. Portions of it are still there. So this picture is really important because it shows the tail race there where the water came out. And this mill ran by turbines that went. They were called tub wheels. They were in the basement. The water fell down a penstock, but this mill was important because this is where the farmers of the Forest Hill allotment land brought their grain to have it milled. So that was very important. And look, and he's the one that did this picture. And the Duty family, I've kind of mentioned that where the house is. The two sons, Andrew and Daniel, did brick making. Daniel was a cabinet maker and he made coffins. You can see his advertisements and old Cleveland history things. Here's a cute story about a whip tree where Andrew's son was going out riding and couldn't find a buggy whip, so he pulled a branch from the willow tree, and when he got back, he stuck it in the ground, and it grew into this gigantic tree. And in the 1940s, when this East Cleveland history was being written, they said the tree was still there. So I didn't know. I want to drive by and see if I can find an old willow tree anywhere, but I thought that was a cute story. Here's a picture of, here's Coventry Road, and it shows you, here's Euclid Heights Boulevard, Edge Hill, East Overlook, Berkshire, etc. This is showing you west of Coventry, so it borders the Forest Hill allotment. But here it shows you, there's the Duty brick house, there's the silos of the farm land, and I don't know how long this lasted, but eventually someone built their suburban home there. They bought the lot. And here's the golf club there. There's the Briggs Estate, there at East Overlook. And here's a close-up of the farm right there. And then here's a picture. Here's the Coventry Library. And I've looked this all over, from the bird's eye view. There's no farm buildings here anymore. And then I want to mention Coventry is an old road. I mentioned that before. Shows up on the deeds very early. The Duty family is all over the Cleveland history. And here's an example. Here's Jenny Duty. She was a temperance leader. Here's a little postcard I found I thought was good. My boys may go to ruin through the legalized saloon by your consent, but your boys never will be by my consent. And I thought it was kind of cute. And that's some information about her. Another Duty descendant. Here's Edwin Duty, who he took care of that farm here in the Forest Hills allotment that straddled both sides of Coventry. But then it says he later bought an omnibus line that ran from Doan's Corners to downtown. And I'll briefly mention Doan's Corners was, as many of you know, was the little city down at the bottom of Cedar Hill. Nothing remains of it today. It used to have a tavern. It's right there near the Art Museum. And we know Bob Hope got his start there, etc. But a lot of the farmers of the Heights, a lot of the farmers had mansions along Euclid Avenue right there at Doan's Corners. And Doan's Corners originally was literally a corner where people came from Pennsylvania along the old Euclid Road, and then they made a little turn there at the Art Museum to head downtown. So that little corners became a stopping place for the people in their wagons, and they'd water their horses at Doan Brook, that kind of thing. And then they mentioned the Shakers again. The Shakers name constantly come up. The Shakers do things like they wash the area's livestock in the water from their sawmill. They diverted some of the water from the sawmill after it comes out, from running the wheel. And they invented a sheep washer, an automatic sheep washer. And the farmers would drive their sheep down there, like the Gales and the Posts and Worthy Streeter. And they literally, without getting their pants wet, they would run the sheep through these troughs and they'd wash them off. So they had an automatic sheep washer in the 1800s. And then during one of the epidemics with the horses, the Shakers, the street trolleys couldn't run, so the Shakers brought their oxen and hooked them up to the streetcars and ran them that way for a couple of weeks to help out the city, so there'd be some kind of transit. And here's another Duty descendant, and he took over, again, he's doing brick. He took over a big brick factory, and you can see that the Duty and the Kozad family intermarried, and of course Kozad's an important Cleveland name. And I want to point this out, a lot of the Cleveland Heights, a lot of the Heights residents and early Cleveland people came from the southwest corner of Pennsylvania, which was Washington County, Pennsylvania. It actually used to be part of the state of Virginia. And those records can be found in Virginia. I thought that was interesting, like the Dillies and the Condits and so many of the Cleveland historical people. All right, this is about James Haycox, and you might know this name because in the Forest Hill allotment today, one of the homes belonged to their son, Thomas, and maybe Mark will point that home out. Here's the old farm. This is from the 1874 Titus Atlas. And I mean, this literally is Lee Road. And it's right here, right around the corner, is where this farm was on both sides. And you can see the the houses and the barnyards, etc., the wagons going up and down. And then the quarry was right here going into Kane Park along Dugway Brook. That was their quarry. And it's a wonderful drawing here. And when I was in the Twinsburg Historical Society, I saw a photograph that looks almost exactly like that. I thought, wow, that's pretty neat. So there's the photograph. And you can see him pouring stone in the 1800. That must have been quite a job. Can't imagine that. And then I couldn't find any pictures of the Haycox family except a descendant. This is Ernest Haycox, and he is actually author of Western fiction. He's the grandson of James Haycox's brother, Thomas. And there's some history about the Haycox family. They're from England. Let's see. Here's one of their advertisements. They also own some of the land here in they own the Cumberland land in Lot 48. James Haycox did for a while. And they probably had a little store along Mayfield there, because Mayfield cuts down B48 right here down the street. And here, this tells you what they're growing. They're growing, graham, buckwheat, hay, feed for the market. They're also selling some coal and coke up there. And Gooding is his son-in-law, James Haycox. Charles Gooding married his daughter, Frances. So now if we came out here and looked down Lee Road, here's old Lee Road, a wood, dirt, very skinny, and there's the Haycox house there. Of course, no longer there. And that's about where East Overlook crosses over Lee Road. And the Haycox family is both in the East Cleveland Township Cemetery. The parents of James Haycox are there in East Cleveland Township Cemetery. And then James and his wife and some kids are here in the Lakeview Cemetery. And now we'll go to the Streeter family. After the Duty family owns the Forest Hill allotment land, in comes the Worthy Streeter family. And Streeter, you can see, is spelled different ways. This is in Lakeview Cemetery. Dr. Worthy Streeter was, he's in his younger years here, his older years. Here's his plot in Lakeview Cemetery. It's on underneath the dam there at Dugway. And you get up there by this very precarious road. It's like going up a roller coaster. But he and his wife Sarah Wakely Streeter, and from New England families. He was involved in the Disciples Church. Here's some notes about the family. When they owned the land off of Coventry Road, it was called the Lakeview Farm. And this little area was Lakeview, because you had the Lakeview Post Office down there off Euclid, and you had the Pryor's Lakeview Wine Farm, and you had the Worthy Streeters Lakeview Stock Farm. So here they had cattle grazing and sheep, etc. Coventry Road went by many names. It was Shaker Road. As all the roads that led to the Shaker settlement were called Shaker roads. It was called the Streeter Road for a while. Worthy Streeter was really an amazing guy. He was looked up to in the community. Although he was trained to be a medical doctor, he really preferred doing anything else. So he got into railroads, and he got into meat packing. He got into all kinds of things. He knew President Garfield, John D. Rockefeller. They had 5 kids. There's the kid's name. It's his son, Sterling Rush Streeter, who ran the stock farm. And his son, Harold, was an artist, and he moved to California. This is a picture I found of the son from Passport. That's Harold Arthur Streeter, Dr. Worthy's son. And I went to the Western Reserve, and they had this catalog there for this Lakeview farm, and I was like, yeah, I'm going to get a picture of the farm finally, It just had cow names in it. That was it. So here are some of the cow names: Duchess of Plumwood, Miss Lincoln, Cletus, Linda Bell, 4th Earl of Oxford. And here's a book I found with the pictures of the livestock, and they even mentioned the Shakers. And now the Shakers were really into like the best livestock possible. That was one of their big things. So no doubt they and Worthy Streeter got together, and they probably supplied him with the stock originally, or with the information about it. This is the coffins underground at Lakeview Cemetery in the Streeter plot. E.B. Thomas is his son-in-law, married to one of his daughters. The 5 kids are all buried here. Worthy and his wife are here buried. And then there's these 2 graves right here. And of course I had to find out who they were. And this is a servant, that longtime servant, Bridget Clancy, who took care of the family. And here's a little anecdote about the Streeter family. The nephew of Worthy Streeter was taking care of the sheep. And when he got to the top of Cedar Hill, he saw what he thought was a wolf-killing dog. So he shot at it, and it turned out to be the wagon maker of Doan's Corner. But he was absolved from that. But that's one of the anecdotes. This is the Streeter house on Euclid. There's an actual photograph of it. It's right down by East 100th and Euclid. Another picture of it. So he would ride his wagon up the hill. This is where the house would be today. Here's Euclid Avenue. There's East 100th, East 97th Street. Here's the Euclid Avenue Congregational Church. His house would have been right there. Here's an old postcard of Doan's Corners, the city 4 miles east of Cleveland. No longer there at all, where Bob Hope got his start. And now I've talked about the Shakers real quick. Here's the Forest Hill Allotment. Here's Cedar Road, and here's Coventry Road coming down right here. And this is walking distance because I know I walked it to Roxborough Junior High almost every day, right? We walked it. And here's the Shaker. This purple is the Shaker land. You see almost a third of it's actually in Cleveland Heights. A lot of people don't know that. Here's the Cleveland Heights. And here's all the Shaker structures, no longer there. All the mills and everything. And the Shakers were important to the area farmers for all the stuff that they did. Here's some pictures of the Shakers. I'm assuming, I won't go into their history, but the religious sect, they would, you see the chairs here? People from the neighborhood would come and watch them, do their dancing and their singing, and they would stay for cheese sandwiches afterwards. It would be a day's outing for the area farmers. Here's some of our local Shakers. If you go down Lee Road, this is what their settlement looked like, just down the road. This is Lee Road right here, Dirt Lee Road. Here's that stone grist mill again. This is the sawmill right there at Coventry and North Park. Again, this is the remains that are still there to this day. Again, they would have been sawing wood. They supplied the Heights and the Forest Hill area with brooms and baskets and medicines and seeds and all kinds of stuff. They would have ridden to Doan's Corner in a wagon like this, in their upright chairs. This was described in Charles Post's book about Doan's Corners. Postcard of the Shaker Lakes. I'm not going to say much about Rockefeller because everyone knows about him, but then he bought the Streeter farm, really as an investment. He's buried in Lakeview Cemetery. Just some pictures of him, family man, believe it or not. He always considered Cleveland was his home, no matter where he lived. You know, he ended up in Florida, but he wanted to be buried back right here in Lakeview Cemetery. And I was really surprised to find out that that's the story of so many people who once had a farm in this area. Where did they go? Where did they travel? Well, they never went very far. They're buried right here. And here's John D. Rockefeller. Oh, this is a good one because now it shows the beginning of the suburbs coming in. Here's the Euclid Heights allotment, which is west of Coventry in Lot 8. Here's the Mayfield Heights development. And of course, we're right here in 48, Lot 48 right there. And then right here is where the Grant Demings allotment's going to be. Here's the Forest Hills estate on our sledding hill. Had to stick that one in. And I'm getting near the end now, but I just wanted to say, this is interesting because this is a Standard Oil ad, and this could be a picture of the Forest Hill allotment in the past. Here's the livestock, the gigantic trees that used to be here, the land was very swampy and mosquito-y. So I thought that was very, very interesting. Here's an old Standard Oil ad and a Brooks Oil competitor. And then Dugway Brook, I've kind of mentioned a little bit. Most of Dugway Brook is underground now. There's very little of it that's above ground, a little bit in Lakeview Cemetery, a little piece here behind Cumberland School, a couple culverted parts that are in the, between Edge Hill and East Overlook, and then East Overlook and Berkshire, some pieces there. But it was quite beautiful. This is actually right here, Cumberland, behind Cumberland Pool. This is one of the culverted parts. This is it's off of Berkshire, between Berkshire and Coventry, or Berkshire and East Overlook. This is, you probably recognize this one next to the home there. This is Dugway going into Lakeview Cemetery, right past Mayfield, where that old road used to be. Probably connected up to Coventry Road at some point. And this is where Caleb Eddy had his grist mill. And what you usually find is there's usually a quarry right downstream from where there's a grist mill. They quarry the stone and they build the mill right above it. As the streams go down the Portage and Cartman, down the hill to the city of Cleveland. And there it is. Isn't that beautiful? I mean, it's just a beautiful, it's too bad it's not still above ground because it is just beautiful. And then some miscellaneous things here at the end. Haycock's farm was also a dairy. Cleveland Heights has a tradition of dairies. I thought it was interesting to see the horse and buggies used to go up and down the streets, even with the beginning of the suburbs. And it's something that's hard to imagine, but. And here's a little joke ad about Cleveland Heights being a one-horse town. This is in the Cauldron. The Cleveland Heights High School Cauldron, like the 1927 Cauldron or something like that. And the street cleaners, someone saying, man, this is a one-horse town, and the street cleaner saying, not if you had my job. You wouldn't think so. Here's some of the transportation. I kind of stuck at the end. This is a painting done by a local artist, Jim McNamara. This is the corner of Edge Hill and Washington Boulevard. You probably recognize it. And so I had to put some local talent in there. And that's it.
I would like to say thank you to Korbi and also mention that the Cleveland Heights Historical Society is honored to have Korbi as its most recent addition to our Board of Trustees, even though she's a foreigner. We're hoping that she will repatriate sometime in this lifetime. So, to bring us into the 20th century, we have Cleveland State University Associate History Professor Mark Souther. Welcome, Mark.
In the middle. Okay. Thank you. Enjoy. Well, I will more or less continue where Korbi left off, and we'll begin with the near background to Grant Demings' Forest Hill allotment. I began with this image, which I extracted from an advertisement from 1909, as you can see at the bottom. This was part of an ad that would have, where my text would have had a lot of fine print about how wonderful a suburban allotment this was. And but I liked the image mainly because it shows the type of text that was used for the titles for most of the ads in the early days of Forest Hill allotment, and that is to say that it was very rustic. It looks like almost like it was built of Lincoln logs. And I live on Lincoln Boulevard, so I couldn't resist having a little bit of, rough-hewn wood here. So this was very typical, and you'll always see this type of print with the early allotment ads. I'll just begin with Grant Deming. And then try to connect the dots back to what Korbi said toward the end. Grant Deming was one of several siblings who were born in Sarnia, Canada. That's in Ontario, so well north of here. They moved to Cleveland and ultimately got into real estate. You are no doubt familiar with the Deming name, even if you didn't think you were coming here today, because Demington is a road that you certainly go by every time you go down Cedar Road. That is named after Deming, although not specifically this Deming. You also probably have seen Barton Deming's house, whether you knew it or not, when you went up Fairmount Boulevard, right out of Cedar Fairmount, and looked at that castle-like Tudor-style house that's in the fork of the road. That was Grant Deming's brother, Barton R. Deming's home. Barton Deming developed the Euclid Golf Allotment from land that had been the Euclid Golf Course, or Euclid Golf Club, excuse me, that had been associated with Patrick Calhoun's Euclid Heights allotment, and which had been bankrolled to some extent by John D. Rockefeller, who was a big golf enthusiast, although he made the disclaimer that if he was going to give money, the golf course would have to be closed on Sunday. And so the ingenious thing that came about was that the golf course ultimately was set up in such a way that the portion of land that was owned by Rockefeller could be sort of gerrymandered out on Sundays. The way the links were laid out, the eastern part of the course was not on his former land, and so it did not fall under that stipulation. So golfers would play the first nine. They played the first nine twice on Sundays, and it might have gotten a little old, but nonetheless, that plot of land would ultimately become another one of these Cleveland Heights suburban allotments, known as Euclid Golf Allotment. Deanna and Hugh Fisher have gotten that one designated as a National Register district as well, and provided a model for my work. Getting back to Grant Deming, he was actually already in real estate before he came to the Forest Hill allotment. In the early 1900s, he and his brothers formed the Deming Realty Company, and so Barton Deming was still involved with Grant at the time and with their brothers, whose names escape me at the moment. But the first allotment there was called the Grantwood Allotment from 1905, and that was in an area that we know as Glenville, the Glenville neighborhood, in the eastern part of the city of Cleveland. Sometimes they called that area the city's East End. That area was one that, if you think about the term streetcar suburb, you tend to think about places like Lakewood and Cleveland Heights, but I would put forth the idea that streetcar suburbs are not necessarily outside the city limits of cities. They go outward over a series of decades. And so if you go back into the 19th century, there was a time, now granted, it was not, it was a time that went across the period of electrification. So you would have had horse-drawn street railways coming up into what is now known as Glenville before electrification. Ultimately, electrification comes by the 1890s, and that, of course, greatly stimulates the development of what I would posit are streetcar suburbs. And so places like Huff and then Glenville are early streetcar suburbs, even if we don't choose to see them as such today. And so in some ways, I think we look at places like Cleveland Heights and East Cleveland as your first order suburbs, your first ring of suburbs, when in fact they were part of this process that had already been going on with people getting out toward the periphery of town. And so nothing in some ways is that fundamentally different whether you're in what we now know as the city of Cleveland or not. Nonetheless, there is something about the Portage Escarpment that does make for a nice definitive line between the city and, quote unquote, the country, what we know as the Heights, broadly speaking. Before I get to that, though, I wanted to say a little bit about Grantwood Allotment. It was the sort of the flagship development early on. It was built prior to the time in which Glenville started to transition toward being a noted Jewish community, and later a noted African American community. So this is an area that undergoes a lot of change in several decades. Glenville goes from being a place not unlike that which Korbi has mentioned, where farmers were there, grist mills, sawmills, tanneries, and the like. It transitions in the mid-19th century gradually toward, well, the latter years, it becomes sort of a resort area. There's the Glenville racetrack right up the road from where Grant Deming builds Grantwood. That dates to about 1870 or so. And so by the 1880s and 90s, this is sort of a pleasure resort for Cleveland's elite. And so there's a sort of this interesting mix of farmers and some small-time industrial, sort of quasi-industrial uses, but also pleasure resorts that took advantage of the fact that this was sort of on the borderland, on the outlying fringes of Cleveland. Now, into the 1890s and 1900s, this really does develop into something very different, something much more like the Heights. And Grant Deming was very much a part of that movement. So all along, imagine you're looking on both sides of Rockefeller Park, where the Cleveland Cultural Gardens are located, or along East 105th Street. That area was filling up with lots of small developments of sometimes a street here, sometimes 4 or 5 streets there by different developers. So think of the Deming Realty Company as one of many kind of smallish developers that are collectively responsible for that area becoming a fine, what was then considered a fine residential section of Cleveland. And over time, it became noted as a fine residential section for Cleveland's Jewish community, which moved out of the Woodland area northeastward into Glenville in the early decades of the 20th century. And then ultimately it became the best place that African Americans could hope to live prior to the developments that opened up the suburbs, what we now call the suburbs. And of course that was a hard-fought process in the 1950s, 60s, and beyond. So I list a couple of other developments here that I'll just briefly mention, all of which are detailed in an interesting little booklet that Kara O'Donnell has a copy of here at the schoolhouse called Home Sweet Home, which was a promo book for the Deming Realty Company. It included many references to Grantwood Allotment, showed every street and many of the notable houses. It mentioned also his 3 developments, 2 of the 3 developments that Deming would ultimately do in Cleveland Heights. It mentioned Hyde Park, which is the street Hyde Park that's just east of here off of Lee, just north of Kane Park. That was concurrent in development with Grantwood, as you can see by the dates. Forest Hill followed 4 years later in 1909, just southwest of where we're all sitting or standing right now. And later Minor Heights, which is just east of here as well. And it's the streets like DeSoto and Beechwood and Berkeley and Altamont, all those streets. And so he became a fairly big developer, at least in Cleveland Heights and the east side of Cleveland. And in the first development of Grantwood, you can see the types of houses that he was developing. Drexel Avenue was touted as being the premier street in the development. It's where Grant Deming built a home for himself. And he was already sort of dabbling in the eclectic styles of the time that would go on to characterize the development in Forest Hill itself. So you can see these are period styles at the turn of the 20th century, more or less. So you have craftsman influence, you have some Tudor influence, and you really have some not to mention colonial revival, but you also have some carryover from the Victorian era. These are homes that in many cases are fairly compact and close together. You can still drive down Grantwood or Drexel or Massey or Pasadena, any of those streets off of 105th, and you can really sort of see the progenitors of the styles that are here in the Heights. I mean, it's not, a drive through Glenville is not terribly unlike a drive through some of the older sections of Cleveland Heights, notably the Mayfield Heights allotment to the north and west of us, right here. So I like the ads because they're advertising and using the same sort of focus on the stonework that you also see with some of the Forest Hill ads. And this is going to be an interesting one for you, I think, because if you've ever seen the house right behind Zagara's Marketplace, now the home of the Medorskis, you'll know this house well. The dark brown house that looks like it almost just doesn't quite fit in the neighborhood simply because it predates, the style predates the styles of many of the houses in the neighborhood. It had a prototype, as you can see, on Drexel Avenue. It was not Demings' house specifically, but it was A.C. Newton's house. A.C. Newton was one of his partners in business once he set out on his own and parted ways in business with his brother Barton Deming. And so these houses are almost exactly the same. The sort of the crenellated roof line of the porte cochere over the driveway was an addition to the home. So if you can imagine the image on the right without that, you pretty much have the exact same home, almost like it's been transplanted. The old home is still there, by the way. If you go down to Drexel, go check it out. It's quite interesting and well worth a drive down. The site, I won't say much here, because I'll basically be echoing on what's already been said. It really was mainly 3 plots of land, and even more so, really 2 big ones. The Rockefeller land that we've already talked about, that included Lincoln Boulevard on the northern edge, and most of the areas west of Woodward generally, going all the way down to where Lamberton comes into Cedar Road. So those parts of the allotment really owe to the Streeter and then later generally John D. Rockefeller's land. Rockefeller transferred the land pretty late in the game before Deming came in the 1900s to his son John D. Rockefeller Jr. And so technically it goes from John D. Rockefeller Jr. to one of Deming's various companies that had different names. The Haycock's farm makes up the eastern portion of the neighborhood now. And then there was this little area up here owned by a Charles B. Gooding. And I really don't know much about Gooding, but it was only a 7.5 acre parcel. So you can see basically it's roughly half and half between the old Streeter farm and the Haycock's farm. Yeah, and actually, so 1/3 and 2/3, I'm a little off there. It's almost half and half, really. Total site is just under 200 acres. By comparison, Lakeview Cemetery, I believe, is 280 acres approximately. So this is, about 85 or so acres smaller than Lakeview Cemetery. I couldn't talk about Forest Hill allotment without saying just a little something about suburban development elsewhere, because really this did not just emerge in a vacuum, nor is it unlike Shaker Heights. It predates Shaker Heights more or less as a development with the curvilinear streets and the generous lot sizes, the use of verdant nature to try to make this a place that was pleasant, healthful, a place that connoted status of the people who called it home. and so forth. There's a long history, really, of places like this that predates not only Shaker Heights, which is our famous example in Cleveland, but also the earlier developments here in Cleveland Heights. It goes back really to the various movements of the early to mid-19th century, believe it or not, and you could keep on tracing it on back to Europe if you chose, to the gardening traditions in Europe and in England specifically. You really would not be going too far to do that. But in this country, we can trace it back to so-called rural cemeteries of the early to mid-19th century. Lakeview Cemetery is our local notable example, but Mount Auburn Cemetery in Cambridge, Massachusetts would be the one I would put forth as possibly the first of that ilk. Frederick Hall Olmsted designed urban parks, most famously Central Park. If you ever have been to Central Park, you know that it breaks parts company with the grid-like pattern of the streets of the city around, and you have these transverse roads that meander and take advantage of they suggest topography more than they take advantage of it. And that was something that the suburban developers really took to heart. Even if you don't have topography, you make people think you do. Now, we do have some, but we accentuate it even more. So naturalistic landscape design, very, very important in these types of developments. They're trying to suggest that you can have a country home without being far from the city. Curvilinear streets seem to follow the topography of the land, whether they actually do or not. A reliance on railroad or streetcar lines made these developments really viable. These were pragmatic developers. They were not going to open up land that was at such remove from the city and so inaccessible as to be impossible to sell lots in. Some prominent examples around the country, these are but a few that we could point to. The earliest one I've been able to find is Llewellyn Park in East Orange, New Jersey. This is about 13 miles west of Manhattan, and it developed starting in 1869. So this has, 1853. The next example was Riverside, Illinois. Maybe the next example, outside Chicago, 1869, and so on. You can see some others, like Forest Hills Gardens in Queens, Brookline outside Boston, Roland Park outside Baltimore, and of course our own example, Shaker Heights. All these were also influenced by, at least the ones that go into the 20th century, were influenced by Ebenezer Howard, who wrote about the so-called garden cities of tomorrow. He was an Englishman and was really concerned about healthful living conditions for urbanites and wanted to resettle people to countryside areas where they would rebuild cities in a more orderly, healthful manner. Once Forest Hill was being developed, I should say a few things about that. Grant Deming bought the land from these various individuals under different company names. So you have things like the Boulevard Land and Building Company that bought what became Lincoln Boulevard. You had, let's see, the Cleveland Heights Realty Company was another big one, and ultimately there's one other one that's not coming to me that was responsible for the western part, the area over toward Coventry Road. So there were three different ones that bought the land, but they were all really operating for Grant Deming and the Deming Realty Company. He got Fred A. Pease, P-E-A-S-E, to lay out the streets. And Pease was the same engineer that laid out Shaker Heights, among other developments. And so, you definitely have people who know each other. This was not done in a vacuum. The original main entrance was off of Euclid Heights Boulevard. You're looking at Woodward to the right, Lincoln to the left. The home right here was originally built for Thomas B. Haycox, who was the son of James B. Haycox that Korbi discussed. So that was not the first house, but it was a house that was one of the early ones, circa 1910. From what I can tell looking at tax records, it appears that the house was finished in 1910 because suddenly it's on the tax duplicate. The building permits are all, the other sources are all over the place as to when this house dates to, but I looked at the tax duplicate as maybe the best source. Probably 1910. It was clearly a house that was meant to take advantage of its site, of this corner site, very prominent. The first thing you see when you come into Demings development, not unlike some houses I can think of in the area that Mary Dunbar is working on. In fact, the one that has the tile roof that's to the north off of Fairmount. I forget the streets, maybe Marlborough and Ardley. Yeah, I believe so, Monmouth and Ardley. And so these houses were definitely taking advantage of their location. Notice the stone pylons on both sides. Those are long gone. But those were hallmarks of Grant Deming. He had the same kinds of pylons, even a little more elaborate down in Grantwood. In fact, he even went so far as to have this sort of banner-like arch overhead made out of probably iron that said Grantwood. And so he used these types of things. And you can also see one today, a smaller version in the eastern end of Minor Heights. If you ever go up Euclid Heights Boulevard where it crosses South Taylor Road and look at the southwest quadrant of that intersection, there's a smaller version, much simpler version. As time went on, these developers, they all started kind of taking shortcuts. And so this was his proud accomplishment, Forest Hill, but he later did, then he went on to Minor Heights, and he's making it a little more everyday than he did with Forest Hill, so he cut some costs there. By the way, one thing I would point out is that, as Korbi mentioned, one little tributary of the western branch of Dugway Brook that ultimately goes to Lakeview Cemetery and on down to Bracknell ran right through here, and there are early pictures of that being dug out to grade the streets and put in the utilities. Selling Forest Hill was something that was done on a regular basis in the Plain Dealer, and you can see ad after ad after ad in the newspaper. Every week there was a big ad. Sometimes an entire page was taken out to advertise Forest Hill, sometimes less. This particular one combined Hyde Park and Forest Hill, as was a common practice for Deming. And you can see, not surprisingly, investment now means independence later. There are all these things saying, you need to hurry up and buy this land and get ahead of the curve. You won't be able to live so close to the city and yet keep your the valued country lifestyle for much longer. And so it's convenience plus country living, and you were never again going to be able to have a home at the city's gates the way you could then. My favorite early ad, really is this one from 1910 that shows the mule-drawn, whatever I'm not sure what to call it really, but it's basically it's used for grading roads, and I'm not really sure what to call it, but just a grader, okay. Something, the simplest things, or the hardest. So this is Washington Boulevard, and they're grading it in 1910, which suggests something to you. And that is that even though Fred Peace laid all this out in 1909, and it looks all good on their plat maps, it's not all there in reality all at once. Like any development, it's sort of done in some stages, and rarely did people have the wherewithal to do it all by opening day. Opening day was, I believe, June 1st, 1909, but you can see as of July 26, 1910, there's a reference to the recent grading of Washington Boulevard. So some things are still underway. This did not just instantly fill up with homes. Some of the other homes that I can find, and I admittedly looked on my own street first, and I haven't really gotten much past that, but most of the houses were not built on spec. They were not speculation homes, in other words. They They were usually sold to individuals, the lots were, and then they built a home. They usually got a contractor to come in and build it. If they could afford it and they wanted an elaborate enough home, they got an architect and they had a builder as well. You typically find architect-designed homes west of Woodward and contractor-built houses east of Woodward, although there are plenty of exceptions to that rule. On every street, there are exceptions. Just a generalization. But one of the things I find notable too, and Korbi has done a great job of talking about some of the features that make these unique houses and show that there's a little bit of wealth really embedded in these homes, even if these are not the very wealthy. But you can see another example here. The references in both cases to what the inside looks like. A vestibule and hall finished in mahogany, dining room in early English. This house here was recently rehabbed and resold on Lincoln Boulevard. It had been a foreclosed home. And note that back then it was touted for having mahogany, dark oak, silver gray oak, and bog oak. So they were really suggesting that these were homes that had a lot of character and distinction. Of course, many other homes just were framed in birch or some other common wood. Yes? Uh-huh.
Do you know where that beautiful golden home is?
Yes. In fact, this home is on Lincoln Boulevard on the south side of the street, just 2 houses west of Cottage Grove. It has lost some of its adornments, including the porch and the railing on the side and the widow's walk on the top, or simulated women's walk anyway. So it looks rather different today, but if you go by there today, you'll see that the bones of the house are still there. You can also see a sort of a slab out front that's all natural looking now from the street, but that's where the porch sat. So they actually built up a bit of a berm there. But this house was actually not a spec house like the one on the left. This one was built for an owner, built to specification, and then the owner got transferred to another city. In fact, one of the other ads, I believe, actually, not this one, but another one actually makes explicit reference to that. You couldn't have asked for a better home if you had, put in this, the specifications yourself. So go ahead and buy this one and buy it at the low price that we're offering it to you today. Don't miss your opportunity. Well, lots did not sell quite as well as Deming had hoped. They sort of stagnated, just as was true of Calhoun's development to the west of Coventry, which is the Euclid Heights allotment, which went up to sheriff's auction in 1914. The same sort of thing happened, though not an actual sheriff's sale. Forest Hill ultimately went into bank receivership. The Guardian Savings and Trust Company becomes the trustee in 1914 for selling lots. So Deming is at that time moving on and trying to develop Minor Heights. He has 1 foot out of Forest Hill already at this point. But at the same time, what's happening that's interesting is that Washington Boulevard, I believe, was really, from what I can tell, was intended to be sort of a grand boulevard, even though oddly it was not the original main entrance. That's what gives me another indication that this was done in stages. It has all the hallmarks of a grand boulevard on a smaller scale than that of, say, Euclid Heights Boulevard or Fairmount Boulevard. It has the divided, it has a median in the middle. It even had ultimately a streetcar line, a one-track so-called dinky, single car that would run back and forth on a schedule. That was actually added in 1914 as an enticement to buy the lots, which were re-subdivided from 100-foot frontages down to 60-foot frontages on the western half of Washington and 50-foot wide frontages on the eastern half. You can still see generally that pattern today with what was actually built. But in 1914, there were only 2 homes already standing on Washington, one of which is the big stucco kind of prairie-style house that's in the curve with a big tile roof. with a red tile roof. That's big too. That home was actually the home of an electrical contractor that was responsible for many of the electrifying many of the buildings in downtown Cleveland. His name was Frederick Work, W-E-R-K. That was his home. He also became an officer in the Forest Hill company that ultimately took over a lot of the operations directly from Deming. So they added the street railway at the same time. You can see FC Work right here. So he's one of the incorporators of the street railway, the Dinky. We've already seen this image. I would mention it only to suggest that also that it's indicative of the fact that Forest Hill, while not as grandiose as some of the other similar developments in the Heights and elsewhere in Cleveland, was nonetheless grouped together with them in not only the local imagination, but even in the national imagination. This was from an issue in 1918 of Architectural Record, and it was put alongside these other rather prestigious names. Clifton Park, which is over on the west side of Cleveland, Wade Park, which is now generally University Circle, like Magnolia Drive, East Boulevard. Euclid Heights, you know where that is. Ambler Heights on the southwestern corner of Cleveland Heights. And, of course, the venerable Shaker Heights. So Forest Hill had its building right up there alongside these other more prominent names. And so it suggested that it was part of a broad movement that was worth noting in 1918. Of course, as the neighborhood goes on, one of the interesting things is over time, people kind of lose the name Forest Hill. There's never any sign that says Forest Hill. You know, there's not something like Grantwood when you enter that. And furthermore, in 1929, John D. Rockefeller Jr. develops what we generally think of as Forest Hill now, which is all the so-called Rockefeller homes and ultimately all the houses that surround those near Forest Hill Park. But our Forest Hill was also named after his Forest Hill estate. So there's a Rockefeller connection to both, only in this case as Rockefeller being the investor, land investor prior to Deming for a portion of the land. So it's not as direct a connection, but the name harkens back to his estate. But back to my point about how people thought of the neighborhood. As time went on, people didn't usually call it the Forest Hill allotment when they were talking about where they lived. They started to say that they lived in the Coventry neighborhood or near Coventry or between Coventry and Cedar Lee. And often you'll still hear people refer to it as such now. And so the Forest Hill allotment name is one that maybe never was lost to historians, but to everyone else, except the very, very interested and curious. Usually it was not really called, you wouldn't say, I live in Forest Hill, or else people would think you lived on the East Cleveland border in the Rockefeller development. So would be true with many other places, no doubt, around the country, people they sort of associated where they lived with nearby landmarks. So the Coventry area, the Cedar Lee area. Coventry School was a big one. Living in the Coventry district really meant something to people here. Another one that I don't have here, but probably should, is St. Anne's, the old St. Anne's Church. So this was part of the St. Anne's Parish, really, and so not the only part, but one of them. For Jews, this became, a popular neighborhood by the 1930s, as well as Coventry Road started to become a Jewish community or Jewish retail center. So over time, the neighborhood was not necessarily known as Forest Hill. And I'll just show you a few examples of the architecture to show the diversity of the styles and sometimes the real eclecticism. You have things like your California style green and green type bungalows, some great examples on Washington Boulevard. You have other more fanciful homes. In fact, this is the home that Chris Roy, standing in the back, who introduced us, grew up in. in Forest Hill. So it's sort of a Swiss chalet effect, but also part of under the rubric of Craftsman. And then this home on Lincoln Boulevard, which certainly is not a Craftsman bungalow, but look at the rafter tails, and there's even a little bit of a Tudor effect with the half timbering. Very eclectic, but certainly not out of the realm of Craftsman. Colonial Revival, some of these speak for themselves. The shutters and the center hall and the symmetry, front gable, side gable homes. Here's my house on Lincoln, but mine is one of those that I think is really kind of a hybrid. It's, I think of it more as Craftsman, but I put it under Colonial Revival because it's laid out like a colonial, yet full of Craftsman features. And a Dutch colonial. There are actually 3 of these houses that are virtually identical. One on Lincoln, one on East Overlook, one on Berkshire. 2 of the 3 are almost unmodified, really, on the outside, but the third has been changed somewhat substantially in terms of siding. Tudor Revival, you can see even that style is highly eclectic. Some of the houses have half timbering, others, well, they have a tad, but not much. And others still are ones that are great examples, like the old Haycock's home there at the corner of Lincoln and Woodward. Great examples of a Craftsman influence creeping in. So those early 1900s Tudor Revival homes in many cities, they're examples where you have a tile roof and large rafter tails, and just some of the features that really suggest kind of this interesting kind of partnership or marriage of 2 styles. Italian Renaissance, there are a couple of notable houses in that style. This one's on Washington. Another notable one is at the corner of Coventry and East Overlook. That was the home of the founder of Canfield Oil Company. This prairie-style house that I already mentioned, home of Frederick C. Work. This is really I think, a significant house architecturally, and we don't really think of ourselves as having homes influenced by Frank Lloyd Wright that much in Cleveland Heights compared to some places. We're certainly not Oak Park, Illinois, but gosh, this is a great example. It was done by the same architect that did that lovely building that was formerly known as El Canon, I guess, or probably El Canon, over on Overlook Road, just northwest of Hampshire, on the right, on the east side of the street. It's condos now, and I forget the name. I think it's Overlook Apartments or something, or Overlook Condominium. Finally, I'll leave you with this map, and I'll just sort of break it down for you a little bit. Basically, I took a map that Kara O'Donnell supplied, and I color-coded based on the building, the exterior, the dominant exterior material or materials, just to try to get a handle on just what was the makeup of the neighborhood architecturally. And you can see this western part tends to have more of the brick houses represented by red. As you move east, you have a predominance of frame houses, or in some cases where it's black, siding has replaced the frame or shingle siding. But you clearly have a mix of a lot of things. Period of significance I chose, which is what you have to do with any National Register nomination. I chose 1909 to 1941, mainly because even though the neighborhood was largely built out by 1928, that's the last date where you have solid building extending up to, you have a break where you don't have a lot going on. Well, you actually, from then on, you don't have much going on. But you do have several houses being built in the 30s and early 40s before World War II that exhibit what I consider some really strong ties to the earlier period styles. And so even though I can tell them apart, and you probably can too, they really are more of the earlier era than they are modern, as in post-World War II styles. So I incorporated them into the period of significance. the whole neighborhood is designated, whether a house is contributing or non-contributing, so don't feel bad if your house is one that's newer. You are in a historic district nonetheless, whether you have a so-called contributing house or not. There are more than 650 houses and even a few carriage houses. Not many, but I think 3 in the neighborhood. And you can tell when the houses were built. A couple hundred in the first several years, up to when we entered World War I, almost up to when we entered World War I. From 1917 through the 1920s is when the most houses were built. So they doubled the rate of the early to mid-19-teens. They doubled that rate between World War I and the Great Depression. And you can see very few houses were built after. And I believe that's all. Yes. Thanks very much.